Part 2, Chapter 3 from Travels and Adventures in Canada and the Indian Territories by Alexander Henry. Read by Frank Blissett. I passed the winter following at the Sault Sainte Marie. Fish at this place are usually so abundant in the autumn that precautions are not taken for a supply of provisions for the winter. But this year the fishery failed, and the early setting in of the frost rendered it impracticable to obtain assistance from Michilimackinac. To the increase of our difficulties, 5 men, whom, on the prospect of distress, I had sent to subsist themselves at a distant post, came back, on the day before Christmas Day, driven in by want. Under these circumstances, and having heard that fish might be found in Oak Bay, called by the French Anse à la Pêche, or Fishing Cove, which is on the north side of Lake Superior, at a distance of 12 leagues from the Sault, I lost no time in repairing thither, taking with me several men, with a pint of maize only for each person. In Oak Bay we were generally able to obtain a supply of food, sometimes doing so with great facility, but at others going to bed hungry. After being here a fortnight, we were joined by a body of Indians flying, like ourselves, from famine. 2 days after, there came a young Indian out of the woods, alone, and reporting that he had left the family to which he belonged behind, in a starving condition, and unable, from their weakly and exhausted state, to pursue their journey to the bay. The appearance of this youth was frightful, and from his squalid figure there issued a stench which none of us could support. His arrival struck our camp with horror and uneasiness, and it was not long before the Indians came to me, saying that they suspected he had been eating human flesh, and even that he had killed and devoured the family which he pretended to have left behind. These charges, upon being questioned, he denied, but not without so much equivocation in his answers as to increase the presumption against him. In consequence, the Indians determined on traveling a day's journey on his track, observing that they should be able to discover from his encampments whether he were guilty or not. The next day they returned, bringing with them a human hand and skull. The hand had been left roasting before a fire, while the intestines, taken out of the body from which it was cut, hung fresh upon a neighboring tree. The youth, being informed of these discoveries, and further questioned, confessed the crime of which he was accused. From the account he now proceeded to give, it appeared that the family had consisted of his uncle and aunt, their 4 children, and himself. One of the children was a boy of 15 years of age. His uncle, after firing at several beasts of the chase, all of which he missed, fell into despondence, and persuaded himself that it was the will of the Great Spirit that he should perish. In this state of mind, he requested his wife to kill him. The woman refused to comply. But the 2 lads, one of them, as has been said, the nephew, and the other the son of the unhappy man, agreed between themselves to murder him, to prevent, as our informant wished us to believe, his murdering them. Accomplishing their detestable purpose, they devoured the body, and famine pressing upon them still closer, they successively killed the 3 younger children, upon whose flesh they subsisted for some time, and with a part of which the parricides at length set out for the lake, leaving the woman, who was too feeble to travel, to her fate. On their way their foul victuals failed. The youth before us killed his companion, and it was a part of the remains of this last victim that had been discovered at the fire. The Indians entertain an opinion that the man who has once made human flesh his food will never afterward be satisfied with any other. It is probable that we saw things in some measure through the medium of our prejudices, but I confess that this distressing object appeared to verify the doctrine. He ate with relish nothing that was given him, but, indifferent to the food prepared, fixed his eyes continually on the children which were in the Indian lodge, and frequently exclaimed, "How fat they are!" It was perhaps not unnatural that after long acquaintance with no human form but such as was gaunt and pale from want of food, a man's eyes should be almost riveted upon anything where misery had not made such inroads, and still more upon the bloom and plumpness of childhood. And the exclamation might be the most innocent, and might proceed from an involuntary and unconquerable sentiment of admiration. Be this as it may, his behavior was considered, and not less naturally, as marked with the most alarming symptoms, and the Indians, apprehensive that he would prey upon their children, resolved on putting him to death. They did this the next day with a single stroke of an axe, aimed at his head from behind, and of the approach of which he had not the smallest intimation. Soon after this affair, our supply of fish, even here, began to fail, and we resolved, in consequence, to return to the Sioux, in the hope that some supply might have arrived there. Want, however, still prevailed at that place, and no stranger had visited it. We set off, therefore, to Michilimackinac, taking with us only 1 meal's provision for each person. Happily, at our first encampment, an hour's fishing procured us 7 trout, each of from 10 pounds weight to 20. At the river Miskautensacky we found 2 lodges of Indians who had fish, and who generously gave us part. The next day we continued our journey till, meeting with a caribou, I was so fortunate as to kill it. We encamped close to the carcass, which weighed about 400 pounds, and subsisted ourselves upon it for 2 days. On the 7th day of our march, we reached Fort Michilimackinac, where our difficulties ended. That was Part 2, Chapter 3 from Travels and Adventures in Canada and the Indian Territories by Alexander Henry. Read by Frank Blissett.